Hello, this is Dave Dubois, the Mexico State Climatologist, and I commonly get a question asked to me, what's the difference between weather and climate? So that's one of the questions we're going to answer here in this short little video. What's the difference? Well, we get lots of different weather patterns in New Mexico during our summer where we get the monsoon. And here's an example of a storm that I captured just north of Truth or Consequences. We can also get funny clouds like these. These are called mamatas clouds. Occasionally we see these right after some storms. And occasionally when it's very dry, we get dust devils like this on a very hot and dry day. And sometimes we even get even longer spells of hot and dry weather. Commonly in the spring, sometimes we get very hot, very dry conditions. And we also get the monsoon. Here's an example of, normally this is a very dry arroyo, but when the rain comes, we get the arroyos to fill up. That looks like this. Occasionally we'll get snow on certain days. And here's a storm just over Albuquerque during the monsoon, viewed from Sandia Peak. You see some areas get lots of rain, some areas don't. Occasionally we'll get some days with severe weather. Here's an example of some nice golf ball size hail that fell in Las Cruces a few years ago. And this is common when we get the monsoon. Some days are rain, some days are not. Occasionally we'll see some funny clouds like these during the summer. So how does all that data help us answer that question? What's the difference between weather and climate? Well, we've been taking data for a number of years in New Mexico. Not a lot of places have been taking data for more than 120 years, but there's a few locations. Here's an example of the climatological summary for 1897. The second line here, Albuquerque, they've actually been collecting data for 21 years in 1897. And just as example, they've been, for that year, the high temperature was 95 degrees on June 25th. In 1897. So at a few locations, we've been collecting data for a number of years. So how does that help us answer that question? Well, each day is like a page in a book. You read a novel, and each page is a clue to what's going on in the book. And sometimes the page before leads to the next page and tells us tells us a little more about the story. And the same way it is with the weather. So each day is like a page of a novel. And then if you put all the pages together, they act like putting together a story. They tell a story. It's just the same way with climate. Each day is a page of weather, and all the different years of weather will provide information on the climate. So here's an example of 30 years of individual days across Las Cruces. And each of those little blue lines are the highs and lows. As you can see that they vary quite a bit on a day-to-day basis. And you can see sort of they dance around. There's some really hot days and some cold days. So how does that help us? So if we look at all the averages over all those, they help us define the average high temperature and the average low temperature. And that's that brown area. And you can see it starts out low in January and peaks toward the end of June. And then it goes back down again. And then it repeats. And then we got the red lines. That shows us the record highs. And then the light blue is the record lows. So all those data that was in that previous slide gives us the information about the climate. When do we get the highest temperature? When do we get the lowest temperature? What is our average high on a particular day? What's the average high for a particular year? The average low for a particular year? When is the first day of freezing? When is the first day of thawing? That's one of the definitions of climate, is the long-term average. And a lot of times we use blocks of 30 years or more. And for climatologists, we like to use even longer periods of time, like 50 to 100 years. So even though there's not a lot of data that's been collected that long, but each day that we have our weather. So weather is the short term and climate is the long term. They say weather is what we get and climate is what we expect.